The stone was cold beneath her bare feet, but she didn't care. Alara moved the broom across the cracked courtyard tiles like it weighed nothing, her body already stirring with something she couldn't name. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, just a thin line of gold bleeding across the horizon, painting the abandoned east courtyard in shades of amber and shadow. No one came here anymore. The castle had dozens of courtyards, grand ones with fountains that actually worked, and gardens that didn't grow wild and angry. This place had been forgotten, and that made it perfect. She was supposed to sweep. That was all. Every morning before the rest of the Omegas woke, before the Alphas strode through the halls with their heavy boots and heavier expectations, she came here to clean what no one cared about. But sweeping never felt like enough. Her hands wanted to do more than push dust around. Her feet wanted to do more than shuffle from corner to corner. So she hummed. It started soft, just a melody her mother used to sing before the fever took her. 3 notes, rising and falling like a heartbeat. Alara's grip on the broom loosened as the tune grew, spilling out of her chest and into the quiet morning air. The courtyard seemed to listen. Even the weeds poking through the stones seemed to lean toward her voice. And then her body decided it couldn't stay still anymore. She didn't plan it. One moment she was sweeping, the next her arm lifted, broom forgotten against the wall, and her foot slid forward in a movement that felt like breathing. Her other foot followed, then her hips swayed, her spine curved, and suddenly she wasn't an Omega anymore. She wasn't the girl who scrubbed floors and kept her eyes down and apologized for existing. She was something else. Her arms floated upward, fingers stretching toward the pale sky like they could pull down the stars that were still fading. She spun, slow at first, letting the worn fabric of her dress fan out around her legs. The world blurred, stone walls, wild vines, the distant towers of the castle, all of it melted into streaks of color. She spun faster, and her humming turned into something wordless and raw, a sound that came from a place deeper than her throat. Dancing was the only time she remembered she had a heart, because most days she felt like a shadow. Omegas weren't supposed to be seen. Not really. They were supposed to exist in the spaces between things, between the Alpha's orders and the castle's needs. Between sunrise and the moment someone noticed you were late, Alara had learned to make herself small, to tuck her thoughts away, to smile when she was supposed to and stay silent when she wasn't. But here, in this forgotten place, she could be loud. Her feet barely touched the ground as she leapt, landing light as breath, arms sweeping wide like wings. She imagined she was a bird, something with feathers and freedom, something that didn't belong to anyone. Her chest ached with the thought, but she pushed it down and turned the ache into movement. She dropped low, knees bent, hands brushing the cold stone, then rose again in one fluid motion that made her feel like water. The courtyard was still. No wind, no voices, just her and the rising sun and the rhythm pulsing through her veins. She didn't hear the door open. She didn't hear the footsteps. She was too far gone, too deep in the place where her body spoke a language her mouth never could. Her arms carved shapes in the air, circles and lines and desperate, grasping reaches. Her legs carried her across the courtyard in patterns that meant nothing and everything. She wasn't thinking anymore. Thinking was for when she had to remember her place, remember the rules, remember that girls like her didn't get to want things. Right now she only wanted to move. Her spins grew wider, her leaps higher, and the humming turned into something almost like singing. No words, just sound, just feeling. Her hair had come loose from its tie, dark strands whipping around her face, sticking to her lips, and she didn't care. She threw her head back, eyes closed, and let herself fall into a deep back bend, fingers brushing the stones behind her. For a moment she hung there, suspended between earth and sky. Then she snapped upright and froze. Someone was watching. She felt it before she saw it. That prickle on the back of her neck, the sudden weight of eyes on her skin. Her breath caught. Her heart, which had been soaring just seconds ago, dropped like a stone into her stomach. Slowly, so slowly it hurt, she turned her head. The archway leading into the courtyard wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood there, half hidden in shadow, but she could see enough. Tall, broad shoulders, the kind of stillness that didn't come from peace but from control, the kind of control that made the air feel heavier. She couldn't see their face clearly, not with the sun rising behind them, turning them into a silhouette cut from darkness. But she knew what they were. Alpha. She could feel it in the way her body reacted, in the sudden tightness in her chest, the instinct to drop her gaze and bow her head and apologize for breathing too loud. Her hands, which had been graceful and sure moments ago, now trembled at her sides. How long had they been standing there? How much had they seen? Alara's mind raced, tripping over itself. She wasn't supposed to be dancing. She wasn't supposed to be doing anything except sweeping, and even that she'd abandoned. The broom lay against the wall, forgotten, a silent witness to her rebellion. She should say something, apologize, explain. But her throat had closed up, and all she could do was stand there, frozen, while her heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. And somehow, that was worse than anger, worse than a reprimand, because she didn't know what they were thinking, didn't know if they were disgusted or amused or something else entirely. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. Ilara's breath came in short, shallow gasps. Her bare feet felt glued to the cold stone. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't listen. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the cracks in the courtyard and never be seen again. But she couldn't, because for the first time in her life, someone had seen her, really seen her, not as an Omega, not as a servant, but as a girl who danced like the world depended on it, who moved like she had wings, who hummed melodies that didn't belong to anyone but her. And she didn't know if that was the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to her, or the most terrifying. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the courtyard, and still the figure stood there. Still she stood there. Two people caught in a moment that felt like it could shatter at any second. Ilara's hands curled into fists at her sides. Her nails bit into her palms, grounding her, reminding her that she was real, that this was real. She had been seen, and nothing would ever be the same. Her legs almost gave out. The Alpha King took one step forward, and Ilara felt that step in her bones. It wasn't loud. His boots barely made a sound against the stone, but it echoed in her chest like thunder. The guards flanked him on both sides, their faces carved from ice, their eyes sharp enough to cut. They looked at her the way hunters looked at prey. She wanted to run. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to move, to bolt through the archway on the opposite side of the courtyard, to disappear into the maze of corridors where she could hide until this nightmare ended. But her feet wouldn't obey. They stayed planted on the cold stone, trembling, useless. The king didn't look away from her. His gaze pinned her in place, heavy and strange, like he was trying to see through her skin and into whatever lay beneath. He had dark eyes, so dark they looked black in the early morning light, and a face that could have been carved from the same stone as the castle walls. Hard, unreadable, dangerous. Who is she? His voice cut through the silence, low and rough like gravel scraping against metal. One of the guards stepped forward, his expression tight with disapproval. An Omega, Your Majesty, assigned to the lower quarters. She was... I didn't ask what she was. The king's tone didn't rise, but the guard's mouth snapped shut like he'd been slapped. I asked who she is. No one answered. The guards exchanged glances, uncertain, as if the question didn't make sense. And maybe it didn't. Omegas didn't have names that mattered. They had tasks, assignments, places they belonged. Ilara had swept this courtyard every morning for 3 years, and she doubted anyone in the castle even knew her name. The king's jaw tightened. Then his hand lifted, one finger pointing directly at her. "Bring her to me." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her breath left her lungs in a rush, and for a moment she thought she might faint. Bring her to him? Why? What had she done? Dancing wasn't forbidden, not exactly, but it wasn't allowed either. Omegas didn't draw attention. They didn't spin and leap and hum like they had fire in their veins. They stayed quiet, invisible. She'd broken the rules just by being seen. 2 guards moved toward her, their expressions grim. Ilara stumbled backward, her hands flying up instinctively as if she could ward them off. I didn't mean... Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. The guards didn't slow. One of them grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not cruel, and she flinched so hard her teeth rattled. The other guard took her opposite arm, and together they turned her toward the king. Her heart was a wild animal thrashing in her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The courtyard spun around her, the stones blurring into the sky, and she had to lock her knees to keep from collapsing. The king watched her approach with that same unreadable expression. He didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. When the guard stopped a few feet in front of him, Ilara forced herself to look down. Her instincts screamed at her to lower her gaze, to bow her head, to make herself as small as possible. Alphas didn't like to be looked at by Omegas. It was disrespectful, dangerous. But even with her eyes on the ground, she could feel his stare. The silence stretched so long her ears started ringing. Then finally he spoke. "Look at me." Her stomach dropped. She couldn't. She shouldn't. But his voice left no room for disobedience. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head. His eyes locked onto hers, and something sharp and electric shot through her chest. She couldn't name it, couldn't even understand it, but it made her skin prickle and her pulse race even faster. He studied her face like he was memorizing it, his gaze moving from her eyes to her lips, to the wild tangle of her hair. "What's your name?" he asked. Her throat was so dry she almost couldn't answer. "Ilara, Your Majesty." He repeated it, slow and deliberate, like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. Ilara. Hearing her name from his lips made something twist in her chest, something she didn't have time to examine because one of the guards cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, she was neglecting her duties. We should report her to the Omega Overseer for discipline." The king's eyes never left Ilara's face. "No." The guard hesitated, but no. The word was final, cold as winter. "Take her to the West Wing. Have the servants prepare a room." Ilara's knees almost buckled. A room? In the West Wing? That was where the nobles stayed, where the high-ranking wolves lived in luxury she couldn't even imagine. There had to be a mistake. He couldn't mean her. "Your Majesty," another guard ventured, his voice careful, "the West Wing is—" "I know where the West Wing is." The king's tone could have frozen fire. "Do as I said." The guards bowed stiffly, and before Ilara could process what was happening, they were pulling her away. Her feet stumbled over the stones, her mind a mess of panic and confusion. She glanced back over her shoulder just once and saw the king still standing there watching her go. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had. The corridors blurred past her as the guards marched her through the castle. She barely registered the twists and turns, the stone walls giving way to polished wood, the cold floors replaced by soft rugs. Everything was too bright, too clean, too different from the cramped, shadowed corners where she usually lived. Servants stared as they passed. Some whispered, others just watched with wide eyes, their shock palpable. Ilara wanted to shrink into herself, to disappear, but the guard's grip on her arms kept her upright, kept her moving forward even though every instinct told her to fight, to flee. They finally stopped in front of a heavy wooden door. One of the guards knocked, and a moment later, A woman appeared, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked Alara up and down, her lip curling slightly. "This is the one?" she asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Orders from the king," the guard said flatly. "She's to have a room. See that she's taken care of." The woman's expression soured further, but she stepped aside. "Fine, bring her in." The guards released Alara, and she nearly collapsed without their support. The woman, Alara assumed she was some kind of head servant, gestured impatiently for her to enter. Alara's legs moved on their own, carrying her into a world she didn't belong in. The room beyond was unlike anything she'd ever seen. A real bed, not a lumpy mat on the floor, curtains that weren't torn, a window that actually let in light. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. "Wait here," the woman snapped, then turned and left, slamming the door behind her. Alara stood in the center of the room, shaking. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, and her hands wouldn't stop trembling. What was happening? Why had the king brought her here? She didn't have long to wonder. Within minutes, the door burst open again, and a flood of servants poured in, some carrying linens, others holding trays, all of them whispering furiously. "It's her? An Omega? Why would he? Did you see her clothes? She looks like she crawled out of the stables." Their words stabbed at her like little knives. Alara wrapped her arms around herself, trying to make herself smaller, but there was nowhere to hide. The servants moved around her like she wasn't even there, preparing the room, setting things down, all while shooting her dark, sideways glances. One of them, a girl who looked only a few years older than Alara, with sleek blonde hair and a dress far nicer than anything Alara had ever owned, stopped directly in front of her. Her eyes were cold, her smile sharp. "You must think you're special," she said, her voice low enough that the others wouldn't hear. "But you're not. Whatever he wants with you, it won't last. Girls like you never do." Alara's throat tightened. She wanted to defend herself, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The girl smirked and walked away, leaving Alara standing there, hollow and raw. The whispers grew louder. She probably threw herself at him. Pathetic. "I heard she was dancing. Can you imagine?" Alara's hands curled into fists. Her nails bit into her palms, grounding her, keeping her from falling apart completely. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted to be noticed. All she'd wanted was to move, to feel alive for a few stolen moments. Now she was trapped. The servants finished their work and filed out, their muttered comments trailing behind them like poison. The door closed, and Alara was alone again. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs finally giving out. Her mind spun in circles, chasing questions she couldn't answer. Why had the king looked at her like that? What did he want? And why, despite everything, did some small, treacherous part of her feel something other than fear when she thought of his eyes? She buried her face in her hands. Outside, beyond the window, the sun continued to rise, and somewhere in the castle, the Alpha King stood alone in his chambers, still thinking of a girl who danced like she had wings. The summons came before dawn. Alara hadn't slept. She'd spent the entire night sitting on that too-soft bed, staring at the walls, jumping at every sound in the hallway. Her mind wouldn't stop replaying the courtyard, the king's voice, the guards dragging her away. She'd tried to make sense of it, but nothing fit together. Nothing made the fear go away. When the knock came, sharp and efficient, her heart nearly stopped. A guard stood in the doorway, his face emotionless. "The king wants to see you. Now." Her stomach twisted into knots. She wanted to refuse, to lock the door and pretend this wasn't happening. But you didn't refuse the Alpha King. You didn't even hesitate. She followed the guard through corridors she'd never seen before, each one grander than the last. Marble floors, tapestries that looked older than the castle itself. Everything gleamed with wealth and power. The kind that reminded her exactly how small she was, how out of place. They stopped in front of a set of massive double doors. The guard knocked once, then pushed them open without waiting for an answer. "Go in," he said, stepping aside. Ilara's legs felt like water, but she forced them to move. She stepped through the doorway into a room that stole her breath. The strategy hall. She'd heard servants talk about it in whispers, where the king planned wars, made decisions that shaped the entire kingdom. Maps covered the walls, marked with symbols she didn't understand. A huge table dominated the center, scattered with papers and small carved figures that looked like soldiers. Weapons hung from hooks, polished and deadly. And at the far end of the room, standing with his back to her, was the king. He didn't turn around. Didn't acknowledge her, just stood there, hands braced on the edge of the table, shoulders tense beneath his dark shirt. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, and Ilara flinched. She was alone with him. Actually alone. Her pulse hammered in her ears. "Come closer." His voice was quiet, but it filled the entire room. She moved forward on shaking legs, stopping several feet away from him. Close enough to obey, far enough to run if she needed to. Not that running would help. He could catch her before she took 3 steps. He finally turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath hitch. He looked tired, dark circles beneath his eyes, jaw tight like he hadn't slept either. But there was something else there too, something she couldn't name. "You're afraid of me," he said. It wasn't a question. Ilara's throat closed. She wanted to deny it, to be brave, but what was the point in lying? "Yes, Your Majesty." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, like that answer satisfied him somehow. "Good, you should be." The words should have terrified her more, but they didn't. There was no cruelty in his tone, just honesty. He was dangerous. He knew it. She knew it, and pretending otherwise would have been insulting to them both. He moved away from the table, pacing to the window. Morning light spilled through the glass, painting him in shades of gold. "Do you know why you're here?" "No, Your Majesty." "Yesterday morning, in the courtyard." He paused, his back still to her. "Show me." Ilara's blood turned to ice. "Show you what?" "What you were doing, the movements." He turned his head slightly, just enough that she could see his profile. "The dance." Heat flooded her face, shame burning through her chest. He wanted her to dance? Here? In front of him? I can't." That wasn't a request. His tone left no room for argument. Ilara's hands trembled as she wiped them on her worn dress. She wanted to refuse, wanted to run, but his eyes pinned her in place, commanding without shouting, demanding without violence. She took a shaky breath and closed her eyes. Her body remembered even when her mind screamed at her to stop. Her arms lifted slowly, hesitant at first, then finding the rhythm buried in her bones. She stepped to the side, weight shifting, hips swaying. No music this time? No humming, just the terrible silence and the feeling of his eyes on her skin. She moved through the motions, spinning, reaching, her feet barely whispering against the floor. It felt wrong without the sunrise, without the freedom of thinking she was alone. But she couldn't stop, didn't dare. When she finally stilled, her chest heaving, she couldn't bring herself to look at him. The silence stretched so long, she thought she might break. Then he spoke, and his voice was different, softer, almost broken. "My wolf has been screaming inside my head for weeks." Ilara's eyes snapped open. She stared at him, confused. He wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze was fixed on something far away, something she couldn't see. "It claws at me, day and night, demands blood, demands action, demands things I can't give it." His jaw clenched. "I haven't had peace in my own mind for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like." She didn't understand. Couldn't understand. The king was the strongest wolf in the kingdom. Everyone knew that. His power was absolute. How could his own wolf torment him? "Yesterday," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "when I saw you moving, something changed." He finally looked at her, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes made her chest ache. "My wolf went silent. Completely silent. For the first time in weeks. I could hear myself think. Alara's breath caught. I don't know. He moved closer, each step deliberate. I don't know what you did. I don't know how you did it, but when I watched you, something in me settled. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the tension in his jaw. I need that again, he said quietly. I need the quiet. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be real. She was nobody, an Omega who swept floors and disappeared into corners. How could she possibly affect someone like him? Your Majesty, You'll report to me tomorrow morning, he interrupted, his tone shifting back to command. Same time, every day until I say otherwise. Panic flared in her chest, but my duties will be reassigned. He turned away, back to his maps and his wars. You're dismissed. She stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Then her survival instincts kicked in and she fled. The announcement came at midday, delivered by the king's head advisor to every servant in the castle. Alara was being reassigned. Her new title, Serenity Companion to the king. The words didn't make sense. There was no such position, no record of it anywhere in the castle's long history. The advisor explained it with clinical precision. She was to remain in the royal wing, available whenever the king required her presence, specifically during times of stress or unrest. The servants erupted. Serenity Companion? One of the kitchen workers spat, her face twisted with disgust. That's not a real position, that's an insult. She's cursed, another whispered, loud enough for Alara to hear. She's done something to him, put a spell on him. No Omega has ever lived in the royal wing. Ever. The blonde girl from before, Alara had learned her name was Cassandra, stood near the back, her arms crossed and her smile vicious. Enjoy it while it lasts. Trash always gets thrown out, eventually. Alara kept her head down, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles turned white. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't asked for any of this, but words felt useless. They'd already decided what she was. The palace officials were worse. They cornered the advisor after the announcement, their voices sharp with outrage. Alara caught pieces of their arguments from where she stood, frozen in the hallway. This is unprecedented. An Omega in the royal wing undermines the entire hierarchy. What message does this send to the noble families? The advisor's response was ice cold. It sends the message that the king does as he pleases. Question him if you dare. No one did, but their anger didn't disappear. It just went underground, festering. That evening, Alara was summoned to a formal dinner, not to eat, but to stand near the king's chair. The instruction came with no explanation, just a curt order from a servant who looked at her like she was diseased. The dining hall was massive, filled with nobles dressed in silk and jewels that probably cost more than Alara would earn in a lifetime. They sat around a table that could have fit 50 people, their conversations polite and deadly. Alara stood behind the king's chair, trying to make herself invisible, but every eye in the room found her eventually. The stares burned. One noblewoman in particular, Lady Morgana, someone whispered, watched Alara like a hawk. She was beautiful in a sharp, dangerous way, with hair like spun silver and eyes that could freeze blood. Her lips curved into a smile that promised violence. Your Majesty, Lady Morgana said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, I must confess curiosity. What exactly does a Serenity Companion do? The king didn't even glance up from his plate. Exactly what the title suggests. How fascinating. Her smile widened. And where did you find such a rare talent? That's none of your concern. The temperature in the room dropped. Lady Morgana's smile flickered, but she recovered quickly. Of course, Your Majesty. Forgive my impertinence. But her eyes, when they slid back to Alara, promised retribution. The king's head advisor, Lord Theron, found Alara the next morning in the garden courtyard where she'd been told to wait. He was older, maybe 60, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that saw too much. He studied her the way a scholar might study an interesting puzzle. "You're the one causing all the chaos," he said, not unkindly. Alara flinched. "I didn't mean to—" "I know." He sat on the bench beside her, his movements careful. "I've served the king for 30 years. I've never seen his wolf this unstable. It's been tearing him apart." Her chest tightened. "I don't understand how I—" "Neither do I, but I've watched him these past 2 days. When you're near, he's different. Calmer, more present." Lord Theron's gaze sharpened. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. He needs you, whether he admits it or not." It was the first kind thing anyone had said to her since this nightmare began. Ilara's throat burned with unexpected tears. "Everyone hates me. They fear you," he corrected. "Fear and hate look similar, but they're not the same. You've disrupted the order they understand. Give them time." But time wasn't something she had. That afternoon, the palace healer, a stern woman named Mira, arrived at Ilara's room with a leather bag full of strange instruments. "The king requested I examine you," she said, her tone professional but curious. Ilara submitted to the examination, too tired to argue. Mira checked her pulse, looked into her eyes, even had her breathe deeply while pressing strange stones against her chest. When she finished, Mira sat back, her expression thoughtful. "You have something I've only read about in old texts," she said slowly. "A peace aura. It's incredibly rare. Maybe 1 in 10,000 wolves carries it. Your presence naturally calms aggression in others." Ilara stared at her. That's not possible. I'm just an Omega." "Being an Omega has nothing to do with it." Mira packed her instruments carefully. "This is something you were born with. A gift." She paused. "Or a curse, depending on who's around you." The words settled like stones in Ilara's stomach. By evening, the rumor had spread. Not about the peace aura, about witchcraft. Someone, probably one of Lady Morgana's allies, started whispering that Ilara had enchanted the king, that she'd used dark magic to claw her way into power. The accusations grew wilder with each retelling. She'd made a deal with demons. She'd poisoned his mind. She was dangerous. The climax came 3 days later during a public court session. Ilara had been required to attend, standing in her designated spot near the king's throne. Nobles and officials filled the hall, presenting petitions and grievances. Lady Morgana stepped forward, her dress shimmering like moonlight, her smile poisonous. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice carrying across the hall, "I have a concern regarding the safety of this court." The king's expression didn't change. "Speak." "There are whispers, troubling whispers, about unnatural influences within these walls." Her eyes slid to Ilara. "Some fear that dark forces have taken root, disguised as something innocent." The room went silent. Ilara's heart stopped. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. "Are you accusing someone, Lady Morgana?" the king asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I merely voice the concerns of your loyal subjects, Your Majesty." She smiled. Perhaps a demonstration of purity would ease these fears, a simple test to prove no enchantment exists. The king's jaw tightened. "There will be no test." "But Your Majesty, enough." His voice cracked like a whip. "If you have evidence of wrongdoing, present it. If not, you're wasting my time." Lady Morgana's smile never wavered, but her eyes glittered with fury. "Of course, Your Majesty. Forgive me." She stepped back, but Ilara saw the promise in her gaze. This wasn't over. The full moon was 3 days away. Ilara knew because the entire castle felt different. tighter, like everyone was holding their breath. Servants whispered about it in corners, their voices low and worried. Even the guards seemed tense, their hands never far from their weapons. She didn't understand why, until the king summoned her that night. His private study was smaller than the strategy hall, lined with books that looked ancient and smelled like dust and secrets. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He stood by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "Close the door," he said without turning around. Ilara obeyed, her hands shaking slightly. She'd been alone with him before, but tonight felt different, heavier. He was quiet for so long, she wondered if he'd forgotten she was there. Then, finally, he spoke. "Do you know what happens during the full moon?" Her throat felt dry. "The wolves, they shift. It's supposed to be sacred." "Sacred." He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness. "For some, maybe. For me, it's a battle." He turned to face her, and what she saw in his eyes made her chest tighten. Pain, raw and terrible and barely contained. "My wolf doesn't want to shift and run under the moon," he continued, his voice rough. "It wants to tear, to destroy. Every full moon, I fight to keep control, and every month, it gets harder." Ilara took a step closer without thinking. "Harder how?" "Last month, I nearly killed one of my own guards." His hands clenched into fists. "He did nothing wrong, just stood too close when the shift began. My wolf saw him as a threat and lunged. It took 4 men to pull me off him." Horror washed through her. "Did he lived, barely." The king's jaw tightened. "The month before that, I destroyed half my chambers. The month before that, I couldn't shift back until dawn. I'm losing control, Ilara. And when an alpha king loses control, people die." She didn't know what to say. Couldn't imagine the weight of that fear, the constant war inside his own skin. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Because you're the only thing that helps." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "When you're near me? When you move the way you do, my wolf? Quiets. It stops screaming. It stops clawing." Her breath caught. "I don't know how. I don't care how." His hand lifted, hesitating just inches from her face, then dropped. "I just need you to stay. Through the full moon. Through whatever comes after." The vulnerability in his eyes broke something inside her. This wasn't the terrifying alpha king everyone feared. This was just a man, trapped in his own body, fighting a battle no one else could see. "I'll stay," she said softly. "Whatever you need." Something flickered across his face. Relief, maybe, or something deeper she couldn't name. He nodded once, then turned away, but not before she saw his shoulders relax just slightly. The moment stretched between them, fragile and electric. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. "Tell me something. Anything. Your voice? It helps too." So she did. She told him about her mother's songs. About the courtyard where she danced, about the small moments that made her feel alive. And he listened, his breathing evening out, the tension slowly bleeding from his frame. When she finally left that night, something had changed between them. Something neither of them dared to name. The Northern Alpha arrived with an entourage that filled half the castle. Alpha Ronin was massive, even bigger than the king, with a red beard and a voice that could shake walls. He'd come for treaty negotiations, bringing with him a dozen of his best warriors and enough arrogance to choke on. The feast held in his honor was mandatory for everyone of rank, which now apparently included Ilara. She stood in her designated spot near the king's chair, wearing a dress that one of the kinder servants had found for her. It was plain compared to what the noble ladies wore, but it was clean and fit properly, which was more than she'd ever had before. The hall buzzed with conversation and laughter, the smell of roasted meat and wine filling the air. Elara kept her eyes down, trying to disappear into the background. Then Alpha Ronan noticed her. "Well, well," his voice boomed across the table, cutting through the chatter. "What have we here?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward Elara. Her stomach dropped. "An Omega," Ronan continued, his smile wide and cruel, standing at the king's side like a pet. How quaint. Heat flooded her face. She didn't look up. Couldn't. "Tell me, little Omega," Ronan said, leaning forward. "What tricks did you learn to earn such a place?" Must have been quite the performance. Laughter rippled through some of his warriors. Elara's hands trembled at her sides. Shame burned through her chest, hot and suffocating. "That's enough." The king's voice was quiet, but it cut like a blade. Ronan raised his eyebrows, clearly enjoying himself. "Oh, come now. Surely you can take a joke. Unless—" His grin widened. "Unless there's more to this than meets the eye?" The king's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. The sound echoed through the hall like thunder. Everyone froze. I said enough. His voice was still quiet, but power rolled off him in waves, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. Ronan's smile faltered slightly, but he wasn't backing down. "I meant no offense, Your Majesty. I'm merely curious about your unusual choice of companion." The king's hand came down on the table with a force that made the dishes jump. The crack of impact silenced every whisper, every breath. "Touch her," he said, each word deliberate and deadly. "And you answer to me." The air in the hall turned electric. Dangerous. Ronan's warriors tensed, hands moving toward weapons. The king's guards did the same. Alpha Ronan stared at the king, his expression shifting from amusement to something harder. Then, slowly, he raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "No offense intended, Your Majesty," he said carefully. "I spoke out of turn." The king didn't sit, didn't move, just stood there, radiating dominance, making it crystal clear exactly where the power in this room lay. "This feast is over," he announced. "Leave." No one argued. The nobles and warriors filed out in tense silence, shooting glances at Elara that ranged from shock to fury to something that might have been pity. When the hall finally emptied, the king turned to her. "Are you hurt?" Elara shook her head, not trusting her voice. His jaw clenched. "If anyone speaks to you that way again, you tell me immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty." He looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he just nodded and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the empty hall, her heart pounding and her mind reeling. He'd defended her, in front of everyone, and the castle would never forget it. The attack came at midnight. Elara had been asleep, or trying to be, in the small room they'd given her in the royal wing. Sleep never came easily anymore, not with everything that had happened. But exhaustion had finally dragged her under. The sound of her door crashing open ripped her awake. 3 figures in black masks surged into the room, moving fast and silent. Moonlight glinted off the blades in their hands. Terror froze her for one precious second. Then instinct kicked in. She screamed his name. "King Adrian!" One of the intruders lunged for her. Elara rolled off the bed, hitting the floor hard, scrambling backward. Her hand found a candlestick on the nightstand, and she threw it. It bounced off the attacker's shoulder, doing nothing. They were going to kill her. The door exploded inward, literally exploded, wood splintering like it was made of paper. Adrian stood in the doorway, and he was barely human. His eyes glowed pure gold, burning in the darkness. His hands had already shifted, claws instead of fingers, lethal and gleaming. His face was caught somewhere between man and wolf, teeth too sharp, jaw too strong. The growl that rumbled from his chest made the walls shake. The attackers turned toward him, weapons raised, but they were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. Adrian moved like lightning. 1 second he was in the doorway, the next he had the first attacker by the throat, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing. The man's blade clattered to the floor. The other two attacked together. Adrian threw the first attacker into the wall hard enough to crack the stone, then spun and caught the second's blade with his clawed hand. The metal shrieked as he crushed it, then drove his other hand into the man's chest. The third attacker ran. Adrian let him go, his attention snapping to Alara. She was pressed against the wall, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Blood spattered the floor. One of the attackers groaned, still alive but broken. Adrian crossed to her in 2 strides, his shifted form terrifying and beautiful all at once. His clawed hands reached for her, and she flinched, not from fear of him, but from the shock of everything. "Did they touch you?" His voice was wrong, distorted by the partial shift, more growl than words. She shook her head. "No, you got here in time." Something in his eyes shifted. Relief, maybe, or rage barely contained. He scooped her up in his arms like she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. "Hold on to me," he ordered. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and he carried her out of the ruined room. Guards flooded the hallway, weapons drawn, but Adrian ignored them all. He took her straight to his chambers. His rooms were enormous, 10 times the size of hers, with furniture that looked like it cost more than entire houses. But Alara barely noticed. She was too focused on the feel of his arms around her, the way his heart pounded against her cheek. He set her down gently on a chair, then stepped back. His body rippled, bones shifting, claws retracting. In seconds he was fully human again, though his eyes still glowed faintly. "You sleep here from now on," he said, his voice rough, but back to normal. "In my chambers. Under my protection." "Your Majesty, I can't—" That wasn't a request. He turned to the guards who'd followed them. "Post 6 men outside my door at all times. No one enters without my explicit permission. Anyone who tries dies." The guards bowed and left immediately. Adrian turned back to Alara, and the fury in his eyes had given way to something else, something that made her chest ache. "They came for you because of me," he said quietly, "because I made you visible, because I—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "It's not your fault," Alara whispered. "It is." His hands curled into fists. "Everything that happens to you is my fault, but I will not let them take you from me. Do you understand? I won't." The intensity in his voice, the raw possessiveness should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel safe. By morning, the entire castle knew. The Omega girl was sleeping in the king's chambers. The rumors spread like wildfire, each one more vicious than the last. She'd seduced him, enchanted him, the king had claimed her. They were mates. She was carrying his child. The whispers multiplied and twisted until Alara couldn't tell truth from fiction anymore. The council demanded an emergency meeting. Alara wasn't supposed to be there, but she heard every word through the heavy doors. Lord Theron had positioned her in an adjacent room where she could listen, his expression grim. "This is unacceptable," one of the elder council members shouted. "An Omega in the king's personal chambers? The scandal alone could destabilize alliances." "The northern pacts are already questioning your judgment, Your Majesty," another added, after the incident at the feast. "Remove her," a woman's voice cut in. "Lady Morgana. For the good of the kingdom, she must be sent away." "Agreed," several voices chorused. Then came the king's voice, cold as death. "No." Silence. "Your Majesty," someone ventured carefully. "Surely you understand the position this puts us in?" "I understand perfectly." Adrian's tone could have frozen blood. "You're afraid of what the other pacts will think. You're afraid of losing status. You're afraid of change." "We're afraid for you," Lord Theron said quietly. "This attachment, it's unprecedented, dangerous." "Dangerous?" Adrian's laugh was bitter. "What's dangerous is 3 assassins breaking into her room in the middle of the night. What's dangerous is the enemies circling this castle, looking for any weakness. What's dangerous is a king who can't control his own wolf. More silence. She stays with me, Adrian continued, and his voice dropped to something quieter but infinitely more powerful. Under my protection, in my chambers, this is not a debate, this is not a request. This is how it will be. Your Majesty, anyone who has a problem with that can challenge me directly. The threat hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Otherwise, this discussion is over. No one challenged him. When Alara was finally allowed back into his presence, the council members filed past her with expressions ranging from disgust to resignation. Lady Morgana's smile promised future retribution, but Adrian stood in the center of the room, unmoved, unshaken. She stays with me, he'd said, and despite everything, the danger, the scandal, the hatred, Alara's heart soared. The castle held its breath as the full moon crawled over the horizon. Alara sat on the floor of the king's chamber, her eyes steady on Adrian. The change had begun hours before, the fevered sweating, body aches, and wild restlessness that always came before a shift. He paced like a trapped animal, his muscles twitching and his voice fading into growls. She reached for his hand, holding on tight even as his fingers began to turn to claws. The pain seized him, his entire body trembling and contorting. Bones cracked, fur rippled beneath his skin. Most would have fled, but Alara stayed. Adrian clung to her name. At the height of the change, when the beast in him threatened to take control, he whispered Alara over and over, soft and desperate, like her name was the only thing holding him here. Her presence was a tether, wrapping the rage, pain, and wildness in a cocoon of peace. He said, voice raw from fighting the wolf, "When you dance, the chaos inside me disappears. It's like you're the moon and I'm chasing you just to survive." She told him quietly, "I dance, so I know I'm alive, so I remember who I am." In that room, in the firelight and moonlight, with the battle raging inside him and the world outside ready to judge, their bond became more than anything the castle's traditions allowed. It was not about rank or duty anymore. It was about survival. It was about the primal sacred space they shared. A place where for a few hours his wolf and her spirit could finally breathe. At dawn, a summons arrived. Every alpha in the territories gathered in the High Council chamber. They wore their power like armor, eyes sharp, and voices louder than truth. They accused Adrian of weakness, for protecting an Omega, for letting her sleep in royal chambers, for letting feelings guide a king. Some demanded Alara be dismissed, sent to live among her own kind forever. Some called for punishment, to make an example so no Omega would ever dare stand beside an Alpha again. Alara stood behind Adrian, trembling, her heart pounding. She didn't speak. She couldn't. But she kept her chin up, refusing to bow her head to the hate. The council roared, demanding tradition and discipline. Adrian rose from his seat, tall and unbowed, and stepped to Alara's side. He let the silence fill the room until every ear strained for his next word. "She silences the wolf inside me." His voice rang out, low and furious. "Without her, I am a danger to this kingdom. She is not a curse. She is my salvation." Shock rippled through the gathered alphas. Some called it madness. Others looked up, young and bold, seeing the truth in his eyes. The council's oldest members glowered, but Adrian did not flinch. Younger alphas began to nod. The king led better, stronger, wiser with her beside him. He did not ask permission. He claimed her before everyone, not as a mate, not as a servant, but as his other half. After the king's speech, palace advisors, grizzled warriors, and even timid Omegas found courage. They stood and spoke aloud. The castle was safer, tempers calmer, arguments fewer since she had arrived, the oldest rules fractured. The council argued, split by voices new and old, but they could not ignore the truth. Adrian was the strongest alpha they'd seen in generations, because a single forgotten Omega stood at his side and gave him peace. The council granted them 3 months. 3 months to prove Ilara's presence strengthened the kingdom rather than weakened it. 3 months before, they would vote on whether she could stay or whether tradition would crush what had bloomed between them. When the massive doors of the council chamber finally closed behind them, Adrian didn't speak. He walked through the corridors, with Ilara beside him, their footsteps echoing against stone. Servants and guards bowed as they passed, but Adrian's face remained unreadable, carved from granite. They reached his chambers. He closed the door. Then he took her hand. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and rough and trembling slightly. He pulled her closer, his other hand rising to cup her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, gentle despite the strength coiled in his body. "I will never let them take you," he whispered, his voice raw. "Do you hear me? Never." Ilara's breath caught. She wanted to lean into his touch, to close the distance between them, to give in to the pull that had been growing stronger every day, but fear held her back. Fear of what would happen if she loved him and lost him. Fear of wanting something she'd never been allowed to want. Adrian. His name felt forbidden on her tongue, too intimate, too real. "Say it again," he breathed. "Adrian." His eyes closed like the sound caused him pain. When they opened again, the vulnerability there nearly broke her. But he didn't kiss her, didn't pull her against him the way his wolf surely demanded. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in, holding himself back through sheer force of will. Because claiming her now, before the council's judgment, would give his enemies exactly the ammunition they needed. So they stood there, trembling with want and restraint, their hearts speaking words their mouths couldn't say. The second full moon came faster than anyone expected. Adrian had been deteriorating for days. The pre-transformation symptoms hit him harder this time. Violent tremors, fever that made his skin burn to touch, and a rage that leaked from him in waves. His wolf was worse than before, clawing at his mind, demanding blood and violence. The guards cleared the entire wing. Lord Theron tried to sedate him with herbs and potions, but nothing worked. Adrian paced his chambers like a caged beast, his eyes flickering between human brown and wolf gold. Ilara watched from the doorway, her heart hammering. She could see him slipping away, the man disappearing beneath the monster. Then he lunged at Lord Theron. The older man barely dodged, stumbling backward. Adrian's claws were already emerging, his teeth elongating into fangs. The shift was coming early, violent and uncontrolled. "Get out!" Lord Theron shouted at Ilara. "Go now!" But she didn't run. She stepped into the room. "Ilara, no!" Theron's voice cracked with panic. Adrian's head snapped toward her, his eyes fully wolf now, golden and feral. He growled, low and threatening, the sound vibrating through the floor. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to flee. Instead, she lifted her arms. She began to move. There was no music, no sunrise, just her body finding the rhythm buried in her bones, the same movements that had started all of this. Her feet slid across the floor, her arms floating upward, her spine curving as she spun. Adrian froze. His growl stuttered, caught in his throat. His clawed hands trembled at his sides. Ilara kept dancing, even as tears streamed down her face. She was terrified, absolutely terrified, but she didn't stop. She poured everything into the movement, her fear, her hope, her love for the man trapped inside the wolf. She spun closer to him, arms reaching, inviting him to see her, to remember who he was. "Adrian," she whispered through the dance, "come back to me." His wolf whimpered. The sound was broken, confused, like a child lost in the dark. His legs gave out and he collapsed to his knees, the shift reversing as quickly as it had begun. Claws retracted, eyes faded back to brown. He gasped for air, his entire body shaking violently. Alara dropped beside him, her hands finding his face, holding him steady. "I'm here," she breathed. "I'm right here." He clung to her, his forehead pressed against her shoulder, his breathing ragged and desperate. Lord Theron stood in the corner, staring with wide eyes at what he'd just witnessed. The king's wolf, the most dangerous force in the kingdom, had collapsed at an Omega's feet, soothed by nothing more than her presence and her dance. After that night, something inside Adrian shattered, or maybe it was something that finally healed. He found Alara in the garden courtyard at dawn, the same place where everything had begun. She was dancing again, lost in her own world, the rising sun painting her in gold. When she turned and saw him, she stilled. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides, and this time, he didn't hold back. His hands framed her face, tilting it up toward him. "You are mine," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not by rank, not by duty, but by destiny, by choice, by everything that matters. Adrian, I've tried to be patient. I've tried to do this the right way to protect you from what people would say, but I can't anymore." His thumb traced her lower lip. "I need you to know. I need everyone to know. The council can burn for all I care." His eyes blazed with intensity. "You saved me, not just last night, but every day since I saw you in that courtyard. You gave me back pieces of myself I thought were lost forever." Alara's breath hitched. "You gave me a reason to be seen." He kissed her then, fierce and claiming, pouring months of restraint into that single moment. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, kissing him back with equal desperation. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pulled her into his arms and held her against his chest. The moon was setting, pale and heavy on the horizon. He lowered his head to the curve of her neck, his lips brushing her skin. "May I?" he whispered, the question heavy with meaning. In werewolf tradition, marking your mate was sacred, a bite that would leave a permanent scar, a claim visible to every wolf who saw it. It would bind them together in ways the council couldn't undo. "Yes," she breathed. His teeth sank into her skin, not deep enough to truly hurt, but enough to leave his mark. Pain flared bright and sharp, then melted into something else, warmth that spread through her entire body, like invisible threads connecting them, heart to heart, soul to soul. When he pulled back, his eyes were glowing faintly gold. "Mine," he whispered against her skin. "Yours," she answered, and the rising sun witnessed their vow. 6 months later, the castle had changed. Not in the obvious ways. The stone walls still stood ancient and proud, the corridors still echoed with footsteps, the guards still patrolled with weapons gleaming, but something fundamental had shifted, like the kingdom itself had taken a breath and exhaled tension it had carried for generations. Alara stood beside Adrian during the coronation feast for a visiting alpha from the Eastern Territories. She wore a dress of deep blue silk that made her look almost regal, though she'd never claimed the title of queen. That would come later, after traditions had time to bend rather than break. But the kingdom respected her now. The palace healer, Mira, had presented her findings to every major pack. Ilara's rare peace aura wasn't just myth or magic. It was real, measurable, valuable. Other Omegas with similar gifts had begun to step forward, no longer afraid to be seen. Galatea. The change rippled outward. In the courtyard below, visible through the massive windows of the Great Hall, children played, Omega children and Alpha children together, mimicking the movements they'd seen Ilara perform dozens of times. They called them wolf songs, dances that calmed and soothed, that reminded everyone that strength came in forms beyond claws and teeth. Lady Morgana had left the court 3 months ago, her influence shattered. Some of the older council members had stepped down, replaced by younger wolves who understood that survival meant adaptation. Adrian watched Alara constantly, his eyes soft in ways that would have been impossible before her. When she caught him staring, he didn't look away, just smiled, a real smile, rare and precious. Lord Theron approached them, his expression pleased. "The Eastern Alpha is impressed, Your Majesty. He's asked if we might send advisors to help train their own peace-gifted wolves." "We'll consider it," Adrian replied, his hand finding Alara's beneath the table, fingers intertwining. The feast continued around them, laughter and music and the clinking of goblets. But Alara felt distant from it all, caught in her own thoughts. She remembered that morning in the courtyard. The cold stones beneath her feet. The way she'd thought she was completely alone. The way her body had moved simply because staying still felt like dying. She hadn't known, hadn't suspected. One moment of dancing in the sunrise had changed everything. Her life, the kingdom, the future of Omegas who would come after her. She leaned closer to Adrian, her lips near his ear. "I was just dancing," she whispered. "I didn't know one moment could change my whole world." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the candlelight, warm and alive and free from the chaos that had nearly destroyed him. "You weren't just dancing," he said softly. "You were surviving. And in teaching me how to survive too, you saved us both." His hand tightened around hers, a promise and a truth. Outside, the moon rose, full and silver and beautiful. But for the first time in his life, the Alpha King didn't fear it, because the girl who danced in courtyards stood beside him, steady and sure, her presence the only magic that mattered. And in the gardens below, children spun and leaped beneath the moonlight, their laughter echoing off ancient stones, wolf songs carrying hope into the darkness. The kingdom had been transformed. Not by war or conquest or tradition, but by one Omega who forgot her place long enough to remember she was alive.